July 25th, 1938. The Ebro River lies still under a moonless sky. Its quiet surface blinds the storm that's about to erupt. On its eastern bank, shadows move with purpose. Republican soldiers crouch low, inflating rubber rafts with trembling hands. Their breath mingles with the cool night air, every sound carefully muffled to avoid detection. Among them is Miguel Martinez, just 19 years old, a boy from Barcelona thrust into the chaos of war. Miguel has never learned to swim, but tonight, that fear takes a back seat to a greater one, the possibility that he may never return. In his pocket, folded neatly and worn at the edges, is a letter he wrote to his mother earlier that day. A letter meant to say goodbye, just in case. Beside him, an International Brigade volunteer from Britain crouches, his voice low and steady as he demonstrates how to hold a rifle above the water. It's a lesson in survival, in how to fight while crossing a river that divides not just land, but the hopes and fates of a nation. None of these men know the full scale of what lies ahead. They are about to launch the largest offensive of the Spanish Civil War, a daring attempt to reclaim the initiative, to turn the tide of a conflict that has dragged on for years. But what they cannot see through the darkness of this July night is that the Ebro offensive will not be a turning point. It will be a funeral march. This is the story of a battle born of desperation, of courage forged in the crucible of impossible odds. It is the story of the Republic's final gamble, a bold strike that would ultimately lead to its undoing. Welcome to Double Helix, Blueprint of Nations. I'm your host, and tonight we journey to the banks of the Ebro, to a night where hope and despair met in the cold, unyielding waters of history. Welcome to Part 8 of the Spanish Civil War story. You know how they say you can't understand someone until you walk a mile in their shoes? Well, I'd argue you can't understand a nation until you've walked through its history. Not just the highlight reel or the sanitized version you find in textbooks. I mean really getting into its DNA. Those defining moments that shaped everything that came after. Those moments where paths were chosen, where decisions were made in palaces and backrooms and city streets that changed the course of millions of lives. I'm your host, Paul, and this is Double Helix, Blueprint of Nations, where we unravel the genetic code of countries through their most transformative moments. Think of it like ancestry testing, but for entire nations. We dig deep into the historical DNA, finding those crucial moments that made countries who they are today. Welcome back, and before you ask, no, this isn't one of those last battles that historians love to debate about. This is the actual last one. Trust me, I spent enough time reading about this Civil War to know the difference. As I've spent a good bit of time studying and reading about military history in general and war, and yes, that explains why I'm categorically considered a nerd, what fascinates me about the Battle of the Ebro is how it combined old and new forms of warfare. You had modern tanks and aircraft alongside tactics that would have been familiar to soldiers from the American Civil War. It was like watching a medieval knight trying to figure out how to parallel park a tank. The summer of 1938 found the Spanish Republic in what seemed like an impossible situation. Franco's forces had cut their territory in two, reaching the Mediterranean at Venados in April. Valencia, the temporary capital, was threatened. The Republic's industrial heartland in Catalonia was isolated from the central zone around Madrid. International support was waning. Even the Soviet Union was beginning to distance itself from what looked increasingly like a lost cause. You might say the Republic was having the mother of all bad hair days, except the problems went slightly beyond cosmetic. But the Republic still had one card left to play. In the mountains east of the Ebro River, Lieutenant Colonel Juan Modesto had been quietly assembling an army. And when I say quietly, I mean as quietly as one can assemble thousands of men and machines in the Spanish countryside, which, given the typical volume of Spanish conversations, and trust me, I know, was quite an achievement. Modesto himself embodied the Republic's transformation. A former NCO who had risen through the ranks based on merit rather than social class. Exactly the kind of professional soldier the Republic had tried to create. The army Modesto commanded was unlike anything seen before in the war. The Corps was the 5th Army Corps, veterans of 100 battles. Supporting them were the last of the international brigades, young idealists from around the world fighting alongside Spanish workers and peasants. They had Soviet tanks, artillery, and for the first time in months, enough ammunition for a major offensive. Although enough ammunition is a bit like saying enough coffee because there's really no such thing in warfare. The plan was audacious. Cross the Ebro at multiple points, strike deep into nationalist territory, and potentially reconnect the Republic's divided zones. But more than military objectives were at stake. The Republic needed to show the world that it could still fight and still win. As Prime Minister Juan Negrin put it, we need a victory to bring our enemies to the negotiating table. The preparation was meticulous. For weeks, Republican engineers practiced bridge building at night using local swimming pools. Artillery units rehearsed their supporting fire with dummy rounds to avoid giving away their plan. Soldiers learned river crossing techniques away from the front. Everything depended on achieving surprise. A Spanish officer named Manuel Tagüeña, who would lead one of the crossing points, wrote about those preparation dates. The men knew something big was coming. You could feel it in the air. Veterans showed new recruits how to waterproof their ammunition. Others practiced with the rubber boats under the cover of darkness. No one talked about it openly, but everyone knew. This would be the battle that decided everything. The crossing itself began in the early hours of July 25th. The noise of the river masked the sound of the boats. The first units crossed with barely a shot fired. The nationalist forces, mostly garrison troops from Franco's Moroccan units, were completely surprised. By noon, the Republicans had advanced up to 25 kilometers in some sectors. It was probably the rudest awakening the nationalists had experienced since the early days of the coup. A nationalist officer diary captures the shock. We woke to find the Reds had crossed the river in force. How was this possible? Yesterday, we controlled everything to the river's edge. Today, we are in full retreat. I imagine his next entry was something along the lines of, "Dear Diary, today is not going well." Franco's response to the Republican breakthrough revealed everything about how the war had changed. Instead of rushing reinforcements to seal off the penetration, as military doctrine would suggest, he saw an opportunity. Let the Republicans advance, extend their supply lines, commit their reserves, and then destroy them with overwhelming firepower. It was like watching a chess master at play. It was a cold, calculating decision that showed how much Franco had learned about modern warfare. He knew the Republic couldn't replace his losses. He knew he had virtually unlimited access to German and Italian aircraft. And he knew that time was on his side. The air assault began on July 27. German Condor Legion pilots described it as target practice. Wave after wave of bombers, German Henkels, Italian Savoyas, Spanish Junkers, turned the Republican bridgeheads into a vision of hell. Fred Thomas, that British volunteer I mentioned earlier, wrote in his diary, "The planes come over in waves of 20 or 30. They bomb us, then they strafe us, then they bomb us again. When they leave, the artillery starts. When the artillery stops, the planes return. This goes on from dawn to dusk. At night, we try to rebuild our positions, knowing that it will start again tomorrow." The Republic fought back with everything it had. Soviet-supplied fighters challenged nationalist air superiority when they could. Republican anti-aircraft guns fired until the barrels melted. Engineering units worked miracles, rebuilding bridges night after night after they had been destroyed multiple times. But it was like watching a heavyweight boxer pound away at an exhausted opponent who could barely keep their guard up. A Republican soldier named Antonio Sanz captured the feeling in a letter home. It's not about the dying that's the worst part. It's the waiting. You sit in your trench, hearing the planes coming closer, and there's nothing you can do. Nothing, except wait and hope they miss you this time. The battle quickly developed into distinct phases. The first was the Republican advance, dramatic but brief. The second was Franco's counterattack, methodical and relentless. And the third, and the longest, was the war of attrition that followed. Hill 666 became emblematic of the entire battle. Republican troops held this strategic height for 11 days under constant bombardment. When Nationalist forces finally took the position, they found the defenders had run out of ammunition, but were still manning their post, with rocks and with broken rifle butts as their only weapons. A Nationalist officer wrote in his report, "These men were either heroes or madmen, perhaps both." The human cost was beyond anything seen before in the war. That summer was one of the hottest on record, with temperatures regularly reaching 104 degrees Fahrenheit. Wounded men lay in the open, unreachable under constant fire. Water sources were contaminated by decomposing bodies. Both sides suffered from disease, from heat stroke, and exhaustion on top of combat casualties. Carmen Ruiz, a Republican medical worker, left an account that brings home the reality of what the soldiers endured. They came to us not just with physical wounds, but with something broken inside them. The constant explosions, the inability to sleep, the feeling of helplessness against the planes, it destroyed something in their minds. We called it bombardment sickness. Men who had been brave soldiers would suddenly start shaking uncontrollably when they heard aircraft engines. Others would become completely silent, as if they had retreated into some inner fortress where the bombs couldn't reach them. As August dragged into September, the battle took on a nightmarish quality. The front lines stabilized, but the killing continued. Franco had turned the Ebro pocket into what one German advisor called a killing zone. Every day, hundreds of aircraft dropped their bombs. Every night, hundreds of artillery pieces fired their shells. And in between, men fought and died for pieces of ground that would be lost and retaken dozens of times. The Republic tried desperately to reinforce without success. They committed their last tanks, their best units, their precious artillery shells. Soviet planes challenged Nationalist air superiority when they could, but they were hopelessly outnumbered. A Republican pilot named Manuel Aguirre wrote about what it was like. We would take off, knowing we were facing 3, 4, sometimes 5 times our number. The German pilots were excellent. Their planes were better. But we fought anyway. What else could we do? Our comrades on the ground needed us. The landscape itself was transformed. The olive groves that had covered the hills were reduced to splinters. Villages became rubble. The Ebro, normally blue-green, ran red with soil churned up by explosions. A journalist who visited in September wrote, "It looks like photographs I've seen of Verdun. The earth has been turned inside out. Nothing lives here except men, and they're doing their best to fix that." Franco's methodical approach was taking its toll. By October, Republican units that had started the offensive at full strength were down to half their number. The international brigades, already depleted by years of fighting, were particularly hard hit. An American volunteer named Steve Nelson described his unit's condition. "We started with 500 men. After 3 weeks, we had 180. After 6 weeks, 95. But we held our position. What was left of it, anyway." The battle became a contest of will between two fundamentally different military philosophies. The Republic fought with the desperate energy of men who knew they were making their last throw of the dice. Franco fought with the cold efficiency of someone who knew time was on his side. A nationalist officer captured this contrast in his diary. The Reds attacked like madmen, taking positions through sheer courage. We retake them through mechanical efficiency, tons of bombs, and endless artillery shells. By late October, even Juan Negrin, the Republic's eternally optimistic prime minister, had to face reality. The offensive had failed. Worse, it had consumed the Republic's last reserves of men and materiel. The retreats began. First, small units, then larger ones. The Republic's engineers, who performed miracles keeping bridges functioning under the constant bombardment, now had to prepare for one final task: getting the army back across the river. The withdrawal itself was a masterpiece of planning under impossible conditions. Unit by unit, the Republicans pulled back, maintaining a screen of forces to hide their movements. A British volunteer named John Dunbar described the last night. "We kept up the fire all night, making the fascists think our positions were still fully manned. Behind us, the rest of the army was crossing the river. Just before dawn, we received the order we've been waiting for. Every man for himself. We ran for the boats knowing that the sun would rise to empty trenches." The nationalists didn't immediately realize what was happening. Their own exhaustion, plus the Republic's clever deception, bought crucial hours. Most of the surviving Republican troops made it back across the Ebro, but they had left behind a terrible prize. Over 20,000 dead, their best equipment destroyed, their offensive capability completely shattered. Looking at the broader strategic picture, the Battle of the Ebro marked the Republic's last chance to change the course of the war. They had thrown everything into this offensive: their best troops, their newest equipment, their last reserves. When it failed, something more than a battle was lost. The dream of military victory died on the banks of the Ebro. The aftermath of the Ebro was as methodical as Franco's strategy had been. The nationalists began positioning themselves for the final campaign into Catalonia. The Republic tried desperately to reconstruct its defenses, but the writing was on the wall, and everyone knew it, though I suspect some were still hoping it was written in erasable ink. The intelligence reports from this period tell the whole story. One nationalist officer wrote, "The Reds fight as bravely as ever, but their artillery now falls silent after 2 or 3 shots. They're hoarding ammunition. Their planes appear on 1s and 2s instead of a squadron. Even their rifles are a mix of different calibers, suggesting that they're scraping the bottom of their arsenals." As a soccer fan, it reminds me of watching a team that's played their hearts out but is now running on empty in extra time. Except, of course, stakes here were life and death. The international reaction to the battle was particularly bitter for the Republic. The British and the French governments, still committed to their policy of non-intervention, used the Republic's defeat as further justification for washing their hands from Spain. The Soviet Union, seeing which way the wind was blowing, began reducing its support. Stalin, ever the pragmatist, was already looking ahead to potential deals with Hitler. The departure of the international brigades in September of 1938 marked another turning point. The Republic hoped their withdrawal might prompt the Germans and Italians to do the same, to leave the war for the Spaniards. But instead, the opposite happened. Franco's supporters doubled down, sensing victory was near. The farewell parade in Barcelona that we discussed in the last episode captured the moment perfectly. A Canadian volunteer wrote, "The Spanish people threw flowers at us, reached out to us, thanked us, but we were the ones who should have been thanking them. We came to fight fascism, but they taught us what courage really means." The Ebro kept flowing, like it has for millions of years. The hills are green again, but the locals still call it La Batalla Más Cruel, the cruelest battle. They were not wrong. More than 20,000 men died here, fighting over hills and ridges that today are covered in peaceful vineyards. Every spring, farmers still unearth the battle's remains. Shell casings, fragments of equipment, sometimes even unexploded ordnance. It is as if the earth itself refuses to forget, serving as an involuntary archaeological museum. Next time, on Double Helix, as 1938 draws to a close, Franco prepares his final offensive against Catalonia. The Republic, exhausted by the Ebro campaign, can barely defend itself. We'll witness the fall of Barcelona, the exodus of hundreds of thousands of refugees across the Pyrenees, and the last desperate attempts to negotiate peace. And we'll see how the dream of a democratic Spain died not with a bang, but with the wary footsteps of civilians trudging through mountain snow, seeking safety in France. Until then, thank you for listening. We will see you soon.